I think what we'll do is I think we'll kick this off and hopefully some more participants jump in as we come. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and happy Friday. My name is Chris Mann. I am the Sponsorship and Business Development Specialist with the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our Navigated COVID-19 webinar series for an important conversation on mental health with our guest, Dr. Adriana Wilson. We are living in a very surreal reality right now in Nova Scotia, and the effect this is going to continue to have on our mental health is a growing concern. This is why it's so important to expand our mental health toolkit so we can continue the conversation and make sure we are equipped to ensure our mental health is a top priority. We are so happy to have Dr. Wilson with us today to answer your questions and provide some insight on how we can best take care of ourselves right now. Dr. Eva Adriana Wilson is a psychiatrist and associate professor with over 20 years experience with community mental health activism and innovation. She is known for translating abstract concepts into relatable language, and better yet, into practical tools for professionals and patients alike. We saw this firsthand with Dr. Wilson when she joined us for a webinar a few weeks ago, and we knew we had to invite her back for more insight. So thank you, Dr. Wilson, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Great. I'm going to, just before we get started, I'm going to start with a few questions that we've prepared, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some questions, if that's okay. Yep. So please leave any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them as we go along. The chat box is another great tool to converse with one another to comment on what we are discussing. A reminder that when utilizing the chat box feature, if you want everyone to see your comment, you will need to address it to the panelists and all attendees. If you send it to all panelists, just myself and Dr. Wilson will see this comment. Okay, so let's get started. So Dr. Wilson, first question for you here. When we think of how to cope with our current situation, where do we begin with taking care of our mental health?
That's a very broad question, very good question, but a very broad one.
And there's a little follow-up to it before you start. Are there tools or strategies we can learn to better cope? So it's not so broad.
Okay. So I'm going to treat that as two questions, if that's okay, because I think there's like a general kind of answer, and then there's some specific things that we can do. So please remind me if at the end of the general one, I forget about the second one.
Sure.
So in terms of generally speaking, we know that one of the big things that we can do to help ourselves stay as well as possible through any major crisis actually is to have structure and routine. And so making sure that we have a schedule, because most people don't really feel motivated to do much of anything if we don't know what we're getting up for. So we need a reason to get up in the morning, and we need to feel like we're good at something. So in our schedule, we need to have some way of building in some sense of mastery. In the schedule, it's going to be very important that there are a few things that are strongly considered. So the basics have not changed. We need to make sure that we're maintaining good sleep hygiene, because sleep, diet, exercise are the foundation of mental and physical health, like they just are. And it's no different now. In fact, they just become more important right now. So making sure that we have a good wind down routine. A lot of people are finding that they're having a harder time falling asleep or settling to fall asleep, or they're waking more often. And some of that, it makes sense when you think about it, that we're being bombarded with stress signals all the time. So threat signals, essentially, that are putting us into a state of fight, flight, or freeze. And if you think of it in terms of like an animal, we are basically being, I'm looking this way because I'm imagining a lion for the metaphor I'm about to use. So imagine a lion over there. So it's like there's a lion with us all the time. And it is actually adaptive if we were in a room with a lion to not fall asleep, right? Because that would feel dangerous. And that if we do fall asleep, that it's going to be a lighter sleep and that we're going to be easily rousable. And so where our bodies are experiencing these constant kind of threatening messages from social media, from news, right? Because we're hearing about COVID, and now we have the shooting, and now the helicopter crash. Like, there's a lot of threat system activation going on. So making sure that we have a routine that allows us to actually wind down. So some of that is going to require going on what I call an attention diet. So limiting your exposure to all of these threat signals, being mindful about choosing 2 or 3 reliable sources of information, and then only going and checking for updates 2 or 3 at the very most times per day, so that you're not always in that state of fight or flight, but you're giving your body a chance to come down and get grounded in between. So going on an attention diet, in that schedule, making sure that you build in time to socialize, because we're actually a social species, and being isolated for prolonged periods of time or not having contact with one another also activates our threat system. So for instance, fun fact for your next Zoom dinner time conversation, is that loneliness, self-reported loneliness, actually carries a higher mortality rate, so that's a death rate, compared to alcoholism or obesity.
Wow.
So just think about that for a minute. Self-reported loneliness, because we are lonely in a crowd of people. So I could guarantee you, because I'm still working as a psychiatrist, there are tons of people who are in isolation with others who are still feeling very lonely. And so self-reported loneliness can carry a higher death rate than obesity and alcoholism. So that means that we really do need to be serious and committed to making sure that the people that we do feel emotionally safe with and connected to, that we're making sure that they are in our schedule. They are not the add-ons that when we finish everything else, maybe we'll get around to. In order for us to be well, we actually need to prioritize connecting with those people in our day. So just to recap, because I know I'm explaining a lot, have a routine. In that routine, make sure that you have an attention diet and that you are connecting socially with people who help you feel soothed or calmer. The other really big thing is going to be exercise, because we're getting all of this energy coming up because of the fight-flight system. And if we don't have anywhere to discharge that energy, it's going to have to start coming out in other ways. So if we go for a vigorous walk, then that's going to give it somewhere to go. If we don't, it's going to come out in overeating, in ruminating, in physical symptoms like tension headaches, or being that like wired but tired feeling. All of those different ways. Or we might kind of start binge watching Netflix to try to distract from the distress that we have. So we want to give our body every opportunity to pass some of that built up energy. So ideally, it would be great if people are able to do some sort of physical movement twice a day to bookend your day, so that you're starting your day with whatever it is that may have been distressing that came up while you were sleeping. You have a chance to kind of shake that off before you start your day. And then at the end of the day, then you have a chance to shake off anything else that's accumulated. So you want to bookend it in that way. So sleep, diet remains a really important thing. We know that what we eat changes our physiology. So if you're eating a lot of kind of heavy carbs, processed foods, that actually predisposes us to feel lower energy and more lethargic. It changes mood and anxiety levels. Whereas if you eat more whole foods and whole grains, vegetables, fruits especially, that makes a really big difference. And they actually make, this is a fun fact for your Zoom dinner time conversations as well, that it actually makes the precursors to the chemicals that we give in antidepressants, like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So your diet can make a really big difference. There's lots more things that you can do, but that would be a really good starting point. So making sure you have a schedule, making sure you have exercise built into that schedule, socializing built into that schedule, and that you're limiting your social media and news coverage in a pretty significant way. And I'm sure some of the other examples will come through as we keep talking, but those would be the general comments. As for the specific part, then there are a few things that you can do. So we know that music is one of the ways that we can directly downregulate or upregulate our nervous system. So if you think about an example, like if you've ever watched a thriller on mute, then it's really just a bunch of dark hallways and empty rooms, and it's really not all that interesting. The only reason that it has as much impact as it does, and we kind of are sitting on the edge of our seats, is because the music is telling us that there's something that's going to happen. And so being able to use music to help us upregulate or downregulate is actually a really powerful thing. So if you're finding that you're stuck in freeze, where you're just immotivated, you feel like a lump on a log, you can't kind of get yourself to do anything, you can't think straight, then using activating music that normally makes you want to kind of move or dance is going to help you get down back into that fight or flight state, which doesn't sound ideal, but it's better than being stuck in that immobilization state. Or you can use music to help you get from that fight or flight. If you play soothing or nostalgic music, that will help you get down into feeling more grounded and into that safety spot. So music is one of the tools that you can use. Another one is gratitude. So we know that the part of the brain that's responsible for threat appraisal and responding to threat signals is different than the part of the brain that's responsible for gratitude, and that they can't really simultaneously both be very active, because I can't be in a state of threat and in a state of appreciation and abundance at the same time. So one of the ways that we can help downregulate our system is by intentionally practicing gratitude. And what I tend to tell people is 3 things every day, no repeats, and for bonus marks, share it with another person. And that will help us stay in that safer zone compared to, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. The next thing is focusing on what we can control. So if I asked you all to make a list of 10 things that are completely out of your control right now, by the time you got to number 10, we would all be feeling anxious. But if I asked you to make a list of 10 things that you can control, specifically focusing on the things that really matter, then you're going to start to feel a little bit better. Because being able to direct our attention is a little bit like a superpower. It completely changes our experience of the moment, and it also changes our physiology, depending on what we're paying attention to. So in the context of what we're experiencing right now, where we're just being bombarded with all of these threat signals, and our outside world is very uncertain and very chaotic, it becomes essential that we are very intentional about being able to carve out and make some space so that we can have some feelings of safety. And gratitude, focusing on what we can control, using music to downregulate are all ways we can do that. Do you want any more? I have more.
Yeah, I mean, sure, I'm sure our audience would love to hear it, so go ahead.
Okay, I'll give you 3 more and then I'll digress.
Okay.
And there are 3 easy ones. So one of the strategies is called labeling. It comes from a form of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, but it's used in pretty much everything. They just have different names for it. Okay. So the way labeling works is, and you tell me if you notice a difference. So just notice your physical response when I say this, and then I'll say it using labeling, and you can tell me if you notice a difference. So the first one is, I'm stupid. And notice how that feels. And now I'm having the thought that I'm stupid. Does that feel any different?
No. It feels different from the first time you said it. Like when you said, I feel stupid, I'm like, yeah, I kind of feel stupid right now. So
right. Yeah. So when we say, I'm stupid, I'm fat, this terrible thing is going to happen, then our brain automatically fuses or believes whatever it is that we're thinking or feeling. It's no different than when we're watching a movie and we're really into it and the bad guy's coming around the corner and our heart starts to race and our palms get sweaty. That happens because our brain just automatically believes whatever we're thinking or feeling. And it's the same process when we're thinking that someone's going to judge us, or that we're going to fail, or that we're going to bomb an interview. It's the same thing. Our bodies react as if it's already happened and it hasn't even happened yet. So we're leveraging that concept, or that happens physiologically when we're adding, I'm having the thought that. It allows us to get a little bit more distance from whatever it is that we're thinking or feeling, and that cues our brain to go, oh yeah, it's just a thought or a feeling. Just like when we're watching that movie and our heart is racing and our palms are sweaty and we go, what am I doing? It's just a movie. And then it takes 10 seconds and all of that goes away. So by saying, I'm having the thought that, or I'm having the feeling that, or I'm having the sensation that, then that creates that extra little bit of buffer that helps us go, oh yeah, I don't have to get so riled up about this. This isn't actually happening right now. So labeling is one strategy. Naming is another. So if there are themes, and most of us have themes, just like, you know, there's different genres of movies like the rom-coms and the thrillers. So we tend to have genres of self-defeating thoughts. So there's the, oh, there's the I'm not good enough story. There's the I'm gonna fail story. There's the everybody hates you story. So whatever your kind of flavors are, because we all have our own, we're all imperfect in that way, then if you can just name the story, then it helps us, again, have a little bit of separation from it so that we're not getting so caught up in whatever it is that our minds are telling us is going to happen. And then the last one is that we can visualize. So a lot of us process visually, so using our imagination is a really great thing, and it's no different than if you see someone wearing a jacket that you really like, you can imagine that jacket on you. Doesn't take a whole lot, and you can go like, oh, actually, no, I don't think that would be my thing. Or you could be like, I should really get that jacket. And so in the same way, we can imagine taking out the thought or the feeling that is causing us distress, taking it out and putting it on something that is constantly moving. So that could be like a classic one is leaves on a stream, watching it kind of drift down the stream, or putting it on a cloud and watching it blow away in the wind, putting it in a balloon. If you're more of a sports person, putting it in a baseball and then hitting it out of the field, or putting it on a train that kind of just goes off into the sunset. When you're using visualization, though, it's very important that it isn't something that is going to loop around. So it can't be something like in a race car that is going to come back. And you don't want to imagine something like putting it on a rock and dropping it to the bottom of the ocean, or putting it in a box and putting it on a shelf. You want it to have that sense of continuous movement. And so by using naming, labeling, and visualizing, those are some additional tools that would complement the gratitude, focusing on what you can control, and the music.
Yeah, those are great. And I mean, I think about myself personally, like if I'm in the middle of a workout and I'm doing something and I'm like, I can't do this, then I'm like, guarantee I'm going to give up halfway through it or whatever. So if I feel like it's, you know, pain is good, get through it kind of thing, then it's a different thing. I like that. And the other couple things that you mentioned too, I mean, exercise, I mean, for me, that's my number one priority in the day is trying to get that exercise. But I've been doing like exercise at home, and you're not getting out and getting that fresh air. And I noticed like specifically Monday, Tuesday, when we had that horrible weather, and I didn't get outside, on Wednesday, I was like, I was wound up. And my wife was like, you just need to get outside and get some fresh air, because even though I've done my workouts, I'm still not getting that fresh air, and that kind of changed things. And then the other point was, we watched, you know, after the terrible things that were happening in Nova Scotia with the shooting, we watched the news at 10 p.m., the national news, and both of us that night had a horrible sleep. Because, you know, you just can't decompress from that. So those were a lot of good things. I like that. The visualization is good too. It's a good point. So I'm going to just look over to the side here as I'm going to read a question. So sorry, I'm not making eye contact. But
that's okay.
please again, for any participant, if you have any questions, there's the Q&A box below, and you can put your questions there. So we kind of talked a little bit about being social, but social media, obviously a very popular thing, is being used at an all-time high right now during social distancing. We have seen a lot of positive connections form through social media channels, but there can also be a lot of negativity or false information spread that can lead to increased anxiety and fears. What's your advice for social media use right now?
Yeah, so I think of social media use kind of similar to the way that I think about feelings. So people often don't like having certain feelings, and so then they kind of blanket say, well, feelings are bad and I'm going to try to not have my feelings. But the way that I talk about it with my patients is feelings are like a fork. You can use a fork to eat ice cream, you can use a fork to eat salad, or you can use a fork to stab yourself in the hand. There is nothing inherently wrong with the fork. It's how you use it. And I think the same kind of metaphor applies to social media use, because it can be a really helpful, positive form of connection right now, where people can feel kind of seen and heard because other people are having similar experiences to them. But as you were saying, it can also be a source of fear-mongering and false information that can be very distressing and activating. And so, you know how I talked a moment ago about how we can imagine like how a sweater would fit on us or that sort of thing? Then we have this built-in mechanism that tells us when we're on track or off track. And we can tap into that by checking with ourselves, does this make me feel stronger or weaker? And we can think about it in the short term and in the long term. So as an example, then to the audience, a general question is, do you have a sense, if you check in with yourself, which you would rather, win the lottery or get punched in the face? Do you have like a visceral sense?
I do, yeah.
You do, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume that for most people, I don't want to make a general blanket statement, but for most people, they would rather win the lottery than get punched in the face. And there's a visceral reaction to those options. And that visceral reaction is part of that kind of gut feeling that tells us when we're on track or off track. In the same way, if we use a less extreme example, then if I asked you, would you rather spend the day hanging out with your kids or with your family or friends who you care about the most, or would you rather help a coworker who you don't even like move? Most people have a pretty good sense of which they would want with that one too. And
I'm not going to say anything because my coworkers are on here, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
And so that sense, if we get into the habit of checking in with ourselves and noticing that stronger, weaker feeling, we can start to use that as our compass. That becomes our guide to pay attention to, oh, when I'm interacting on social media with these things, then I'm left with this sense of distress or panic. I feel weaker. I feel like lower, more tired. But when I interact in these groups or with these people, then I feel more uplifted. The other thing to do, so one of them is we need to actually be checking in with ourselves to monitor, because we don't know how things are going if we don't check in. And so we want to be able to monitor what's going on for us and what our response is, and let that actually inform our actions. The next part is related to choosing 2 or 3 reliable sources of information. And so if you have come across something that has turned out to be false, it would probably be wise to maybe look at not going to that source of information moving forward, and finding more reliable sources going into the future. And then the other thing to do is, so the first one is stronger, weaker. The second one is the reliability of your sources, and limiting which ones you go to. And then the third thing would be that we want to make, oh, there's a question. Oh, thank you.
So you can finish your thing if you want.
Sorry, I got distracted because
that's okay.
my screen. And I forgot what my third thing is, so I'll have to get back to you.
Oh, okay. It isn't actually a question, just someone just dropping off, but just thinking it's a great session. So that's great.
Oh, right. Okay, I remember my third point now.
Perfect.
Thank you. So it was that every now and then we want to do what is sometimes called a dopamine detox. So have, you know, an afternoon or even better, a day in the week where you have no screens, no social media. Because social media is an ever-changing source of stimulation, right? Because it's like a video game, right? There's constant new information that is telling our brain we need to be on and reacting and responding and having an emotional response as well quite often. And so having some downtime where we're just away from all of that will help our bodies kind of settle down, and it'll make it easier to check in with ourselves when we're not constantly being bombarded with more information, even if it's good information, more information.
Okay, those are helpful. That's great. I think a lot of it too is like getting back to your first question portion when you're talking about visualization, can't say it, but visualization. A lot of times too, you hear about people experiencing envy on social media when they're looking at someone's Facebook on these great exotic trips, but a lot of times you don't really know what that person's going through. Even though they're having a great trip, it looks like you don't really know. So that can be another pigeonhole that you can always kind of fall into. At least in my experience. Sometimes that you're like, oh man, I wish I was on that trip or that golf course, but you don't know all the kind of things that are happening behind the scenes there too, right?
Yeah, I had a patient describe that as, I'm constantly comparing my autobiography to everybody else's trailer.
Right. Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
don't put the really kind of painful stuff in a trailer.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. So a question that kind of hits home for me, we have a couple of children in the household, and by children I mean teenagers that really don't want anything to do with us. But I think there are probably a lot of parents out there that are tuning in as well. So parents have been home with their children for like the last 6-7 weeks. We know family life impacts work life. Do you have any suggestions for coping skills during this time for parents and children?
Yeah, I do. So I have 3 children as well, between the ages of 11 and 16. So
Okay.
we have the full gamut. We have 3 boys. And so I can relate to that question. I would say that there's a couple of tips for parents and children coping. One of them is that we're not going to do it right all the time, and that we can be explicit about that. We can say, it's not normal for us to all be home all together all the time and trying to work or do schoolwork at the same time. So we're going to need to make sure that we're kind of checking in with each other to make sure that what we're doing is working or not working. So it's like setting the table or setting the stage so that you can improve communication during a time where you anticipate there's going to be bumps. So that would be the first thing. The next would be, there are 5 things that we can do that will increase the quality of the interactions. And that goes a long way, because if we're feeling more settled with one another, we interact better. We have less bickering, there's less misunderstandings, and it's generally a more positive experience. So the first one is to make sure that we maintain eye contact. So for younger kids, this can happen through games like staring contests or blinking contests, but it's important that we focus on eye contact intentionally, like looking up when your kids come into the room or vice versa, because when we're distressed, quite a number of us will naturally kind of start to pull away, and we will decrease our eye contact with other people in the house. And that's experienced as a form of emotional presence. As humans, we experience eye contact quite often as a source of emotional presence, and it becomes distressing to other people when it isn't there. So for instance, I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with someone who, for whatever reason, struggled with eye contact and they were always kind of looking elsewhere or looking at their phone, then it actually is distressing to the person trying to speak. And quite often, and I do this in one of my groups, that we do an exercise where the other person is intentionally not to maintain eye contact. But I don't tell everybody what's going on. I only tell half the people, and then we debrief about it after. And the people who don't know what the condition is, who are trying to have a conversation, they'll start to try to follow their gaze. They'll try to like fall into the line of sight by moving their head. And this happens, like, I run this in a group that I do regularly, and it happens in every group that people try to figure out, like, what are they looking at? Can you look at me instead? So making sure that there's eye contact on a daily basis for a regular amount of time. The other one is making sure that there's still physical contact. Because we're a social species, we actually downregulate and respond very strongly, even to very slight touch. And it can be like touching someone's elbow or patting them on the back when they come to the kitchen for breakfast or something. And with younger kids, then they do well with even more. So that it's more important that they have cuddles, that they have time to play rough. It could be massaging their feet or their hands when you're watching a cartoon or a movie with one of your kids. So eye contact, physical contact, and then what we were talking about with exercise applies here as well. So if there is a schedule and a routine in place for the family where there's physical discharge available to them, then everybody's going to be happier. It's a little bit like having a puppy, regardless of the age of the child, that if the puppy is well exercised, then they behave better. And the same is true for adults, and the same is true for kids. And with little kids, you can play games like, how many jumping jacks can you do in 2 minutes? Or can you hop through the kitchen and the living room? And how long does that take you? Or playing tag, getting them outside and having races, that sort of thing. So eye contact, physical connection or contact, physical exercise, and then it can't be serious all the time. So just like our fight, flight, threat systems or freeze systems are on a lot of the time right now with everything that's going on, theirs are as well, because their normal has also disappeared. They can't go to the normal ways that they have unconsciously or consciously coped before. They can't just go hang out with their friends. They can't just go ride their bike all over the place. And so they also need some way to discharge that, but they also need time to play or to think about other things. And so laugh with your kids. And that could be, if you don't have a lot of bandwidth, that could be watching funny YouTube videos, or it could be looking at memes together, or it could be, if you have more bandwidth, then it could be playing imaginary games or making up silly songs, or you know, making up a story where each person only contributes 3 words. But it has to be, there has to be some element of play. And there's actually in attachment theory, then there's a saying that says families that play together stay together, because play is a very strong way of adding positive pennies to the relationship piggy bank. So play is the 4th part of that. And then the last one would be activities that make you breathe together, because breathing, just like music, is a direct pathway into the autonomic nervous system, which regulates our fight, flight, freeze response. And so things like singing, where your exhale is longer than your inhale, they're especially powerful tools to use, because they press on the vagus nerve, which helps us downregulate more. So singing with your kids, and it can be silly songs. You can combine the play with the breathing one, or it could be whatever they want. Do karaoke. We did that a couple of weeks ago. So singing together, and then blowing bubbles also requires that longer exhale than inhale. So does blowing up balloons. So does chanting. So all of those would be especially helpful activities to incorporate into your day. And then of course, things like yoga or mindfulness or meditation, because those regular breathing patterns will help downregulate kids. So those would be the main things in terms of helping families cope during this time.
Okay. Those are a lot of great helpful tips. So thank you on that. I appreciate it. The like the physical touching one about the like massages and stuff. Can you get your kids to massage your feet while you watch a movie? Because I think that's what I'm going to propose. Dr. Wilson said that you have to do this. So after this webinar, I'm going to go up and make sure that happens. So no, excellent. Those are great helpful tips for sure. And that's one thing like we try to do is we try to have, you know, every couple of nights we try to have like the family dinner where all 4 of us are sitting down together and having conversation that way. I mean, we'll have dinners in between or lunch and breakfast, but the 4 of us at dinner that we're sitting down and we're dedicated to each other, no phones, no nothing. So that kind of helps bring it in. But the doing the activities together, it's a little bit more challenging for teenagers right now, because they're not as engaged as they want to be, because they want to be with their friends. And I get that, it's understandable. So speaking of kids and keeping that kind of in general, they've been out of their regular routines. What's a suggestion to get them to help them transition back to transition into the new normal, I guess? What's some suggestions that we could do to help them cope?
To help the kids transition to the new normal?
Yeah, sorry, I butchered that question, but that's
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the big things is actually structure. Okay. So having structure in place as much as possible now, and it's obviously going to be different than what would normally be part of their routine, because they don't have to get ready for school and leave for school in the same way that they normally would. But I know that for a lot of families, then structure has not been a big thing. And so one of the ways to help them start to transition is actually to start implementing more structure again. And if you already have structure, then it would be starting to adjust it to mirror what we expect the new requirements will be. So if we know that they're going to be going to school, I don't know, for part of the day, or they're going to need to be on more, then you want to make sure that their sleep schedules accommodate that, right? Because you were talking about having teenagers. A lot of teenagers are up through the night right now because they don't really have to get up for class in the same way that they normally do.
Right.
So adjusting the structure and routines that are currently in the house to mirror so that they can start to transition to whatever that new normal is. And then other than that, it would really depend on any underlying issues, because people who have anxiety at baseline, who have become kind of accustomed, this is a great time to have social anxiety in some ways, because it's like socially expected that you keep away from other people. And so there's only so much small talk you can do from a distance of 6 feet.
Yeah.
And so when the pressure, the social expectation goes up again, then that's going to be difficult for some people to transition back to that. And it's a little bit like if you're afraid of dogs and then you don't interact with dogs for a really long time, then that fear of dogs increases. And so if you're afraid of people and you don't interact with people in a particular way for a really long time, then it can make those initial interactions harder. And so doing things like what I would call comfort challenges, even while you're still off. So make sure that when you do, I don't know, have to go to the grocery store, you initiate a conversation with a stranger. It doesn't mean that they'll respond, but that you'll at least put yourself out there. And that with someone that you feel kind of emotionally safe with, that you go out on a limb and have a vulnerable conversation, like talk to them about something to do with like your hopes, your fears, your dreams, something that is a little more personal. Make sure it's an appropriate person to have that conversation with, but those would be examples of comfort challenges, so that we haven't completely kind of atrophied that muscle when it's time to start transitioning back.
Okay, great. We do have a question here, Dr. Wilson, so I'll read that to you here. We as parents have serious problems to deal with our young children, specifically working from home, and they often end up glued to screens such as video games or TV, or they continually demand to play with them. Is there any way to provide them through electronic sources and still they are happy?
So I'm understanding that question to be, what are alternative ways to keep kids happy without screens?
I think so,
Are
yeah.
you understanding that the same way?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So yes, there are. It's going to depend on the age of the children, what the appropriate activities would be. However, I will say that screens, as we talked about before, are very, very engaging. And they're very stimulating. So there's not going to be a lot of other things when kids have had a lot of exposure to screens. It's a little bit like giving them a lot of sugar. It gets their brain accustomed to that level of stimulation, and then other things will all seem to pale in comparison. A little bit like cocaine. Once you've had that hit of cocaine, the way the brain responds is everything else kind of pales for a while until that is completely cleared. So doing something like a dopamine detox, having a day where there is just no screens, and that would have to be a day that you're available, because you can expect the kids will, be bored and bicker and all of those sorts of things, and they'll need some guidance on alternative things to do. But having a day or two where you have a dopamine detox will make doing creative projects, doing artwork, writing a story, reading a book, they will become more engaging after they've had a period of being off screens, so that it doesn't feel quite the same. And it really, like that metaphor with, or the comparison with sugar is quite accurate in a lot of ways, because if you've been eating a lot of sugary foods for a while, and most of us have had this experience at some point, right? Christmas, Easter, birthdays. We have a few days where we eat a lot of unhealthy foods. And then for a little while after that, like all other food that isn't sugary seems really unimpressive. And we really want more of that sugary stuff. And we have 3 or 5 days where we're really testing our willpower to not go buy another chocolate bar or have another cupcake or rummage for more leftovers. And you can expect it will be similar for the kids getting off screens if they've been on screens for a long time. The other thing that you can do that can be very helpful, and again, it's hard to answer this question with a lot of specific examples without the ages of the kids, but is if you need time to be able to absolutely do your work and not be interrupted, then having a high value reward at that time. So having a movie or a show that they are only allowed to watch between noon and 2 when you have a big business meeting. and that is the only time that they get it. And that, or having a certain set of toys or activities that they only get at a certain time. So for instance, with some of the families I'm working with, then they have younger kids, and the mom has to do a Zoom call or something. And because they're younger, then periodically they're screaming and crying. And so they set up a tent in their backyard, and between, 12 and 2, let's say, then that is when the kids play in the tent. But that's the only time the kids get to play in the tent. So that it's always very appealing, very attractive, and it keeps them occupied, because novelty and limited access increase our sense of desirability of something. So I hope that's helpful. If you have more questions, then you can, about that, you can just send me some more detailed follow-ups.
Great. We do have another question here, so this is awesome. So keep them coming. I've gotten very comfortable spending time alone at home. I'm nervous it will be difficult to get back into my routine once restrictions ease up. Any tips that might help increase motivation to go back to a normal life? Good question.
Yeah,
I think we're all feeling that.
Yeah, absolutely. So humans are a really funny species, because we adapt very quickly, and we tend to take things that are impermanent and we just kind of try to force permanence on them. And an example of that would be, one of my therapist friends talks about if Martians or aliens suddenly like invaded New York, then after 3 weeks, it wouldn't even be in the papers. It'd just be like, yeah, aliens live in New York, like that just be the thing. And so for a lot of people, the initial transition has been really difficult, or had been very difficult. But 6-7 weeks in, they're like, okay, I can do this. And they're like, okay, well, this is how it is moving forward. But in the same way that we adapted one way, then we can adapt back the other way relatively quickly. But the thing that will make it easiest to transition back is to think about our values. So the difference between a value and a goal is that a value is why the goal is important. So for instance, if I say, I don't know, I want to lose weight, then I want to lose 5 pounds. We'll say that's my goal. Then if I ask myself the question, why do I want to lose 5 pounds? Then that will tell me something about the driving value, the piece of the compass that makes that important. And so it could be because of my health. It could be because I want to be around to take care of my grandbabies. It could be because I want to feel more confident when I go out socially. So it could have to do with socializing. And so the same goal could reflect a number of different values. But if you ask yourself, what is my goal? Then that will tell you something about what the values are. And that's important here, because when you think about who you want to be when we transition back, and none of us really know what the new normal is going to look like when we do transition back anyway right now. We just don't, all of the chips have not yet fallen, so we just don't have that information. But a lot of people are starting to think about, okay, so what are the parts of what's gone on that I've liked, that have worked for me, and what are the parts that I need to find some other way to meet those needs? So being able to focus on what our values are allows us to persevere even when things are difficult or uncomfortable. And so when we are clear about that, then that gives us motivation. It's almost like it adds in a layer of meaning to our distress or our suffering. So we know that meaning is a major source of motivation. So for instance, for anyone who read Viktor Frankl's Man's Quest for Meaning, I believe is what it's called, then it's about a psychiatrist who was imprisoned in a concentration camp. And so he wrote this book where he talks about his experience, both watching the guards and the inmates alongside of him. And there were a number of people in this book who, the way that they made meaning out of all of their suffering was that they had made a deal with whatever God they believed in, and said, just give me all of the suffering and protect my children, protect my spouse. And so then when they were being beaten, when they were being starved, then it had meaning, and they actually lived longer and survived with more resilience than people who didn't have something like that. And if you don't believe me, then think just for a moment, let's just do a thought experiment. And if I asked you to walk barefoot on a bed of coals for no reason, then you would feel every step. But if I asked you to walk on a bed of hot coals barefoot to save the life of the person who matters most to you, most of us would barely even notice it until after. And so being able to create meaning out of our struggle is a huge source of motivation. And that's where being clear about what our values are can help us transition back through some of the discomfort that will invariably be there for most people.
Great. Yeah, great points. We do have another question here. So our kids are in the age range of 4 to 7, and we live in an apartment building. So it's most efficient for us to get outside, but it is kind of scary and it's not really safe, they feel. If we were out and then the kids insist to go into a park, making it more challenging, is there something to do to get the kids to get some exercise, but not, I have friends same way. They're just like, I wish parks were open so we could just get them to a park. Is there anything that they could do outside to get that fresh air, but not kind of motivate them to want to go to a park? I don't know how. That's a challenging question for sure.
Yeah, this is where props really help, and your engagement. So bringing a ball, and then if you start kicking the ball, like if a parent starts kicking a ball with kids that age, even if there's a park right there, then they will want to engage with the parent, because they don't get parents 24/7 in terms of engagement quite that way. And that is the most rewarding thing for children of that age. So bringing something to engage with them can be really helpful. And it can be a Frisbee, it can be a ball, but it can also be just bringing a couple of stuffed animals or dolls and then making them run and then having them pretend to kick the ball or do a scavenger hunt. So this is actually a really fun thing that I still do with my youngest son and my nephew. When we go for walks, then we'll pretend that we're top secret spies and I'm in charge of the spy agency, and their first mission is they have to find a car that has a number 5 in the license plate. And then they have to find a house that has green on the door. And then they have to find, and you just look in your neighborhood and you find something that is just off in the distance. So they have to like look for it a little bit, but it's not impossible for them to find. And then you just change the mission. And then as we're walking, then I'll say, oh no, now you have to sing happy birthday really fast at the top of your lungs. And now you have to do it while hopping on one foot. So there are ways that we maintain engagement with our kids, but they're still getting exercise and they're playing with us. So you're getting that play component of the 5 things that we had talked about with the kids as well.
Okay, those are great.
Situation.
I'm just thinking about my mission is going to be to weed the garden. Like that's going to be a great mission for the kids as soon as we're done here. So steered away from kids a little bit, what are some signs of a friend or co-worker that may be struggling during this time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One thing would be that they're looking tired, or they're complaining of being more fatigued or not sleeping well. We know that sleep is one of the first things that goes off for a lot of people. The other things are, if you think about it in terms of that fight, flight, freeze, so either they're becoming more self-critical, so they're putting themselves down, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I screwed up this too. It can be kind of subtle comments like that, because fight, people often think of is attacking another person, so being prickly or irritable or snappy, and that's certainly one version of fight, but fight can also be attacking us by becoming perfectionistic, self-critical, doing things that we know aren't good for us and then beating ourselves up for it, like eating that extra bag of chips or piece of chocolate cake. So anything where there's a change in terms of their mood in that way, but they can also go into that flight component where they're more withdrawn, they're avoiding, they're not responding to texts or emails or invitations the same way that they usually do, or they could be tipping into freeze. And freeze is when we become detached, numb. Cognitively, it's harder to think through things, like even mailing a letter, which is a relatively simple task, becomes a bit overwhelming. We don't have the energy to even go and clean our kitchen, leave the dishes for days at a time. And some of that is because when we go into a freeze response, it's because we're getting the message from whatever's going on in our world and internally that escape is unavoidable. And, you know, you can certainly see why a lot of people would be tipping into freeze right now when, you know, there's the COVID, and then most recently there's been the shootings on top of that, and now the helicopter crash. So you can see why that would happen for quite a number of people. And so it's a little bit like the gazelle, where the lion has already sunk his teeth into the gazelle. Then the gazelle can't fight anymore, they can't flee anymore. Then the kindest thing that they can do is for themselves is to not be there as much as possible. So they detach, they shut down. It's a similar response as when mice feign death when they're in a cat's mouth. So it's an immobilization response. So what we see in people when they start to detach is they become more apathetic. They just really don't care about anything. They're not engaged. And you can feel it sometimes when even when you're talking to them via Zoom or on the phone, there's like a hollowness or an emptiness in the interaction. And so when that happens, so those would be some of the classic signs. Or if they're telling you about drinking every night, right? That would be another form of fleeing or avoidance. Or if they're telling you that they're online shopping all the time and it's out of control, that would be another form of avoidance. So if you're getting any of those pieces of feedback, then those would be little red flags that I would encourage you to then do what I call a reflect and wonder. I think this came up at the end of the last session as well. You say, I'm noticing that, and then you fill in the blank, and I wonder if, or I wonder how. So as an example, it would be like, I'm noticing that you seem really tired lately, or I'm noticing that you don't seem like yourself lately. I wonder, is everything okay? Or I wonder, is there anything I can do to support you? Or I wonder, how would you like me to respond when you're telling me that you've been drinking for 4 days in a row? So doing that reflect and wonder. And just to remember that it's actually disrespectful to take like a one-up position and start telling them what they need to do. That's disempowering. So you don't want to be like, you know what you got to do? You got to do this, that, and the other. And that's actually sending the message that they're not capable. And as much as we want to, you know, bring the horse to water and make it drink, that's not how it works. People will drink when they're ready to drink. And so all we can do is help them see the connection and let them know that other people are also seeing that connection. And that can motivate people to move towards that willingness to take the next step. So if they say, yes, I'm actually really struggling, then that might be a time that you can say, well, I wonder if it would be a good time for you to reach out to whoever, whatever the next steps that might be available in your situation would be.
Okay, great. So I'm just looking at the time here. So we're probably going to wrap up soon. So I'll probably ask one more question. Sure. I don't see any more questions coming through, so I'll just ask this one and then we'll finish off. So are counselors or therapists offering any virtual options currently? And if so, how can I access those?
Yeah, so quite a number. Not everybody is, so you would have to call to find out. But I know certainly we have a counseling therapist and a psychologist at our clinic at Inspired Living Medical, and they're both offering virtual appointments. I know that Nina Wolf and Associates are also offering virtual appointments, and there's several others that that are scattered throughout the city that are, but you would have to call ahead. So that would be for people who have coverage for things like psychology or counseling therapy. EAP workers, as far as I know, most of them are actually offering virtual appointments. And then there's also resources available through the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And also if you go to, I think it's novascotia.ca, then COVID, there's a COVID section, and there's a number of other resources that are available there. And then I agree, Kids Help Phone is offering mental health support for kids of all ages via text, which is also very helpful. Thank you for reminding me, whoever wrote that.
So before I close everything out, thank you, number one, Dr. Wilson, and I'll thank you again. Is there any closing remarks to leave us with?
I would say be compassionate with yourself, and that if you walk away with one thing, then it would be to check in. Because if you don't check in, it's kind of like a radio station where you're trying to tune in, but it's all staticky, you're not quite on the right frequency, and that makes it hard to hear what your body is trying to tell you and it's always telling us what we need in order to be well. And so we can't actually take the right steps if we're not tuning in. So even though it feels overwhelming and you're not going to want to tune in sometimes, because what's going to be there might be grief or anger or hurt, because there's a lot of loss right now, then it's still really important to check in with yourself and listen, and then act based on the information that you're getting from your own intuition.
Great. Thank you very much. That's awesome advice. So just to close up, thank you again, Dr. Wilson. We really appreciate you joining us again today. And thank you to all the people that attended and asking questions. We really appreciate it. We are hosting more webinars every week with experts in sales, banking, and more. Head to halifaxchamber.com/events for a full lineup. We also recorded this webinar today, and it will be available on our YouTube channel to all attendees shortly. Thanks again, and we'll see everybody at the next one. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.